Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discern This, a podcast that brings you some insights into global affairs. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. We are into the fourth month of Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza. It continues to kill or wound thousands of Palestinians, while Israeli media report 137 hostages remain held by Hamas inside Gaza. More than 27,000 Palestinians have been killed thus far, most of them civilians. There's a huge toll of women and children. People on all sides are waiting and watching to see if diplomacy and the case before the International Court of Justice will push the warring parties toward a ceasefire. Let's get some perspective on all of this, and we are happy to be joined by Zaha Hassan. She is a human rights lawyer. She has done research. She's based in Washington, D.C., and she's been actively working within the Palestinian-Israeli issue for many years. She's a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Many people hope that when South Africa brought its case of genocide before the International Court of Justice against Israel, it might have pushed everyone toward a ceasefire, but that hasn't happened. How much meaning does that case still have?
I mean, the case was hugely important. I mean, think about it. This was a state-to-state complaint, a complaint that directly addressed Israel as a state, coming from another country, South Africa, with a lot of experience with respect to racial discrimination and structural violence. And it was about the crime of crimes. You can't get worse than the crime of genocide. So there was a lot of hope, like you say, that this case, at least in its provisional request, would get us to a ceasefire. We didn't get that from the court. We got something very, very close in terms of stopping the killing. The court didn't say stop the indiscriminate bombing of Palestinians. It said stop the killing. It said that humanitarian assistance needs to be, brought into Gaza effectively and immediately. It said that this genocidal language that Israeli officials have been using to talk about the campaign in Gaza needs to stop. And it basically, to implement the provisional measures, you would need a ceasefire because there's no way to bring in the kinds of aid that is necessary in Gaza without stopping the fighting, so people could, humanitarian workers could be safe, and so that there could be some remediation to all that's been destroyed in Gaza, so that you can allow for this to happen. But I think what we did see with this, with the decision from the International Court of Justice, and that this provisional ruling, was that there was a changing of the framing around what Israel's doing in Gaza. Before the ICJ opinion, there was still talk of Israel's self-defense, and, maybe Israel was going beyond bounds in some cases, but the general frame was one around Israel's right to self-defense. And I think what the International Court of Justice did was to recast that in terms of this violence towards Palestinians as a group, the intentional killing of Palestinians as a group. And that was really important to really change the frame in that way. And I think for a lot of different audiences, it'll have different impacts. I know there are members of Congress that are deeply concerned about the weapons transfers, and they're deeply concerned about U.S. complicity, given that the International Court of Justice said there is a plausible case of genocide taking place. So there's much more pause with respect to making sure that the U.S. is not complicit among members of Congress, at least. And I think also within the administration, though we're not seeing the effects of that yet. But we're also seeing civil society much emboldened by this confirmation of what they had been saying for a while, that what it appears to be happening in Gaza appears to be a genocide. And so I think it will continue to embolden civil society in this way. And just today, we actually have a report of a Japanese company, Itochu. Has an aviation unit that's breaking off its cooperation with an Israeli company, Elbit Systems, taking into consideration, they say, of the ICJ order. So I think there will continue to be these effects as we continue to see Israel prosecute its campaign in Gaza.
Well, the U.S. has, of course, staunchly supported Israel's right to defend itself, as it says, after the horrific October 7th attacks. And, it too, though, has to be very careful because it is the main supplier, as you pointed out, of the weaponry that's pouring into Israel and the bombs being dropped on civilians.
Absolutely. I mean, the U.S. is the principal supplier. They are not just providing the weaponry, which most of Israel's weapons are either U.S. funded or U.S. weapons. But it's also providing Israel with a diplomatic cover to continue to prosecute the war. It's blocking Security Council resolutions around a ceasefire. It's engaged with other countries, encouraging them to stay by the U.S.'s line when it comes to Israel. So it carries a lot of water for Israel around what's taking place in Gaza. And you definitely can start to see now some daylight between the U.S. and Israel. I think from the very beginning of this Gaza, Hamas, and Israel conflict, there was this approach that the Biden administration took, which was to really embrace Netanyahu and say, the U.S. is with you. And you saw the U.S. participating in war cabinet meetings with Israeli officials, really taking on this position that the U.S. is a partner with Israel in the prosecution of the campaign in Gaza. But I think you're starting to see much more daylight, much more criticism of Netanyahu. We're hearing reports of President Biden really having some strong words for Netanyahu because, the president is taking a lot of flack internally in the United States with different constituencies that he needs to win the next election. But he's also hearing it from within his own administration. He's hearing it from civil servants outside in Europe and elsewhere, and diplomats all over the world that, this cannot continue in this way. There needs to be an end, and there needs to be some sort of clarity on exactly what is the objective here. I think we've all lost sight of, this idea that it was to, degrade Hamas and to obliterate Hamas. We now understand that that isn't probably going to be something that the Israelis can achieve. So then the question is, what exactly is the goal? And because it looks a lot like it's one in which the target is aimed at civilians and civilian infrastructure in Gaza, making it impossible for Palestinians to live as a community in Gaza.
Well, and that's precisely what the Palestinians who are looking on, say from the West Bank, are seeing. We talked to several of them, and they indicate that clearly they're making Gaza unlivable for the Palestinians that remain there, while you have government figures and others openly talking about, well, the rest of the world should take in these. They should take these Palestinians off of our hands. The Biden administration, obviously, as you noted, concerned about the effect that it's having on his election chances. He's in a tight race. It looks like he's going to be coming up against Donald Trump once again. But the Muslim vote, particularly in places like Michigan, sending a message saying, we're not going to automatically give you our vote. So Joe Biden comes out and says, you know what, Palestinian statehood. And he's dangling the prospect of that. But at the same time, it's conditional. It comes down the road. It's deferred. And Palestinians have been through that before.
Yeah, and you really can't you can't use the possibility of a Palestinian state as a substitute for stopping the bombing in Gaza, for stopping the killing in Gaza. I mean, the question of a political solution, definitely we should keep our eye on that and not lose sight of the fact that the reason why we have this cyclical escalations in violence in Gaza is because we don't have a political solution, one based on international law and a consensus around the two-state solution or any political solution that would guarantee the rights of Palestinians. But we also have to bear in mind that we're still in the middle of what the International Court of Justice has said is a plausible genocide. And so the priority should be on stopping the killing, stopping the bombing, and preventing the forced displacement of over 2 million people. We're at the point now where the desperation is so great that, we're already seeing signs of wasting, signs of starvation. And this is in a very young population. Half the population are children. And having them go for long periods of time without sufficient nutrition will have long-term impacts on them. Going for long periods of time where people have, catastrophic injuries, lost limbs, now disease setting in and not having medical care, will have consequences for those who make it to the end of the campaign, Israel's campaign, alive. It will have long-term psychosocial impacts on the people. So the idea that we're going to sit around and talk about, regional integration, expanding Abraham Accords and Palestinian statehood while we do nothing to stop what's continuing in Gaza is just abhorrent. And I think for most Arab Americans, Muslim Americans in this country, that is really the priority. And that's why so many of them are just so angry, to be frank, with the Biden administration, because it isn't seeing Palestinians as humans, as valued humans that deserve to live in safety and in peace. And so I think we saw that with the president's visit to Michigan. The Arab American community did not want to meet with him. They were deeply offended that, it took, him on the election trail, to basically want to talk to them. And it just felt very, as they said in a letter to him, very performative.
Exactly. Well, it was all about the election. It was all about their votes supporting him. And meantime, there are immediate concerns. In the first week of February, there's been, more than 100 children that have gone from Gaza, some other Palestinians as well. They've gone to Italy, and they're getting some treatment there. But there's questions whether Israel is even going to let some of those people back.
Oh, absolutely. We're already hearing talk from Israeli officials about, rebuilding settlements in Gaza. So, if they're already putting down plans and holding conferences to talk about the recolonization of Gaza with Jewish settlers, there is a huge risk that Palestinians that are forced out, whether it's because they need medical treatment or because of the starvation that they're experiencing and the pressure that's on Egypt to allow Palestinians in to save them, essentially. There is a huge fear that Palestinians won't be allowed in, and I think it's a very legitimate fear given Palestinian history with ongoing displacement since 1948.
Well, and a reminder that there's more than 100 Israelis being held by Hamas in there. Their families are very upset because they see the lack of humanitarian aid as affecting them as well. Everyone is affected by this that is in Gaza right now.
That's what's so infuriating. Yeah, that's what's so infuriating. The hostages are just at risk of the bombing, of the destruction. They're just as at risk with starvation as the Palestinians living there. So how this translates into responsible strategy on the Israeli part, if the goal is to destroy Hamas, as they say, how this makes any sense for the Israeli hostages, let alone the Palestinians who've been dying in the now tens of thousands.
Some have made the point that if the United States, if the Biden administration was really serious about ending this conflict, getting a ceasefire, making the parties come to some kind of a settlement, it could simply cut off the arms. And it shows no willingness to do that. In fact, if anything, it seems that the Biden administration is doing everything possible to keep that flow of arms moving.
I mean, as a Israeli former major general in the Israeli army said, all the U.S. would have to do is just shut the tap off on the munitions to Israel, and Israel would have to stop the bombing of Gaza because it's that dependent on U.S. arms. Even if the U.S. didn't stop arming, if they just slowed it down to make it difficult for Israel to continue at the pace, I mean, that would be something. But it's not been willing to do that. Again, it's sticking to the line that Israel has this right to eliminate Hamas as it needs to, without, its seemingly regard for the consequences on the Palestinian side of the ledger. And so, it's not a question of does the U.S. have sufficient leverage over Israel? It has all the leverage. It has the leverage diplomatically in the Security Council. It has the leverage with respect to the arms that it ships to Israel and resupplies in the middle of this campaign. It's just a question of the political will to do it, and it's telling that half of Americans believe that the Biden administration is not conducting itself in the right way with respect to this Israel's war on Gaza.
You're able to see this, your perspective in this, and you're passionate about it, but you really see a point in time where we've reached an inflection point. I think many Americans are waking up to the fact that the human rights of Palestinians have simply been disregarded for the past 75 years or more. And at no time have we seen a conflict that resulted in this many children losing their lives, losing, really, even the ones that survive have lost their lives. They've lost their education. Many have lost their parents. They've been orphaned. It's a tragic situation, but sometimes that's what it takes to wake people up.
I definitely see that there's a huge change that's happening in the U.S., but not just in the U.S., around the world, with this realization of, what's happening in Israel-Palestine. It's, you see it in terms of the polling in the U.S. And the way in which Democrats in particular, have been really horrified by the disregard for Palestinian life. You see it in terms of those in the Biden administration, civil servants that are expressing their outrage at the failure of the administration to take account of what they call a genocide. You see it in terms of the Biden campaign staff, former campaign staff, that are also pushing the Biden administration and letting them know that this can't stand. I mean, it's in every institution in the U.S., local governments. I mean, Chicago passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire. I mean, you're starting to see everywhere you turn, people just horrified by the idea that, something terrible is happening right now where we don't have effective institutions to enforce kind of normative behavior. And not only that, but the one country that purports to be that force for good internationally, that helps work towards respect for international law and multilateral institutions, is the actual state that's blocking a ceasefire, is the state that's allowing this genocide to take place in Gaza. And so I think for a lot of people, it's not just learning about the Palestinian issue that's driving sort of this awakening. It's also just this fear of, where is this going to lead us? If we no longer have institutions like the UN that can speak with some kind of moral authority and to stop, international conflicts like this, if we can't rely on the US to be that force to stop something like a genocide taking place, where does that leave us? Where does that leave anybody? I mean, we are all less safe in a world in which we don't have these kinds of institutions and norms.
Well, we look at it and we see the reality on the ground, and I think a lot of people are rethinking things. But at the same time, and maybe there's a legal opinion here, we hear this notion that Israel is being singled out, that these standards aren't applied to others. It's being unfairly criticized for simply defending itself. How much of a legal standing does that have?
This has always been the refrain that this is about Israel's security, and that Israel's only reacting to Palestinian violence perpetrated against Israelis and Israeli civilians. I think this, the Gaza Israel war that's been going on now for almost 4 months has really turned that narrative on its head. Like I said at the top of this of our conversation, it's really hard to maintain this idea of self-defense when you see entire neighborhoods that have been just control bombed so that the entire neighborhood's destroyed, or you see the complete destruction of 60 to 70% of the housing stock in Gaza, when you see that the weight of 2 nuclear bombs has been dropped on a territory that's twice the size of Washington, D.C. When you think about the fact that within this short period of time, you have 27,000 people killed, the majority of whom are women and children. I mean, it really belies this idea of self-defense and Israeli security when you see that really the vast casualties that have taken place are just civilians, just people trying to live their lives and unable to do so because for the last 16, 17 years, they've been trapped in the Gaza Strip, unable to have normal economic activity, unable to travel in and out, unable to have basic supplies, that aren't, subject to the Israeli veto of whether they can have certain foods in the country imported. I mean, it's to that level of control that they've been living their lives for the last 17 years under the strict siege, but really for as long as, since 1948, really, because most of the population of Gaza are refugees and their descendants. And so this, the security argument can only take you so far, and you have to completely disregard the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to, believe that. There's something much more going on here, and it's about, forced displacement of a population in favor of another population. And, that's called ethnic cleansing. That's called, a war crime. And that needs to be called out. And we need to, if we're thinking about political solutions, we have to know exactly what the problem is in order to move past it.
Well, you've talked about congressmen, senators, others. They're listening. They're paying attention. They don't like what they see. This whole concept of the indispensable nation. Frankly, I mean, the U.S. record for handling tragedies in the Middle East, I don't know how much worse it could get, but this is a case in point where, countries like Russia, China, and others that are trying to stare down the United States and its influence in the region really have an opportunity to point to and say, is this the kind of indispensable nation mediator that you really need to solve your problems? And the message is being heard clearly in the southern hemispheres.
Definitely. I mean, the global South has been, really at the forefront of calling out this. I mean, when you think about South Africa being the agent for civilians, for Palestinian civilians to be able to save lives, it's not the United States that's at the ICJ. It's not the the U.S. leading for ceasefire resolutions in the ways that they would for other countries experiencing aggression by another country. And I'm thinking, obviously, of the Ukraine-Russia conflict here. So, this is really going to cripple the United States' ability to pursue their agenda around, supporting, stronger multilateral institutions, supporting the rules-based international order, supporting international law, it's going to make it that much tougher for the U.S. to be credible among the global South, even among the Europeans, who are obviously very horrified as well by what's happening, in Gaza. So I think, this isn't just a question of a moral issue. It is very much so that first and foremost, but it's also an issue of how does this serve the U.S. national interest? How does this policy serve the U.S. national security strategy that was laid out early on by the Biden administration that talked about centering human rights, centering international law, and our institutions that uphold those things? It really makes it much harder for the U.S. to be that credible voice internationally.
And it's got Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu openly defying the Biden administration. One of the things that Mr. Biden has put forward is that he wants to see a renewed, refurbished Palestinian Authority step in and handle Gaza when all of this is over and the dust begins to settle. It may be too soon for us to even think about that, but you've worked with the Palestinian Authority. What are the things that they need to do, and why has it taken 30 years or more to try to get it done?
Well, first of all, Netanyahu has never been interested in, a Palestinian state, and definitely has come on record saying he will not support Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza. He would actually, like to see, when he talks about reforming the Palestinian Authority, he's not talking about, a Palestinian Authority that's legitimate to its people, credible to its people, and one that's able to pursue a two-state solution. He's talking about a Palestinian leadership that will be willing to accept the status quo as Israel defines it.
When they met in Madrid in, what was that, 93? I was standing outside the conference where everybody was speaking, and there were, peacemakers were coming out of all corners. And I went outside, and there was a lone man standing in a courtyard, pounding his foot into the pavement, into the sidewalk, in a large courtyard, all alone, and muttering to himself. And I walked up to him and I said, "Bibi, what's wrong?" Because it looked like he was having an apoplectic fit. And he says, all of this must be stopped, this whole peace thing. And he's made good on that through the years. He has successfully blocked the entire peace movement.
I mean, he's quite proud of that. I mean, we've heard him say recently that, he's quite proud of his record in thwarting a Palestinian state and opposing the two-state solution. He at one point sounded like he might be in support of a two-state. If you recall, during the Obama administration in 2009, his Bar Ilan speech that he gave at the university, where he said, yes, he would support two states for two people, but first, Palestinians would have to, recognize Israel as a Jewish state. It's not enough to recognize the state of Israel. Palestinians would have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state and forget about refugee return. And then he also said that the settlements could not be dismantled and they would have to continue to grow, and essentially was saying to Palestinians that, one, you will never have refugee return. Those Palestinian citizens of Israel could face denationalization because, if we ever feel threatened as a Jewish state by the demographics and how they work out for us, you may be stripped of your citizenship, and basically told Palestinians living in the occupied territories that, this is the land of the Jewish people, and if, you're in the way, then our settlements come first. So that was his rendition of a two-state solution. I mean, you can see what kind of game he was playing. obviously Palestinians aren't going to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, particularly when Israel has never defined its borders. So this amorphous thing called Israel is going to, has since it's not defined, means that it could very well end up on some, taking the entire West Bank, which is what we see right now, because Netanyahu says that he will never allow for anything but Israeli security control over all of Gaza and all of the West Bank. Effectively, that is annexation of the entirety of the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And that's Netanyahu's idea of a solution. Doesn't leave much room for Palestinians.
No, it doesn't. Does it leave much room for people like yourself, Zaha, that work within the law, saying, let's stand up for those rights, those principles that we've all vowed that we represent and we support? Let's really stand up for them in courts of law, before the UN, in all of these different venues. How do you keep your optimism that will work someday?
I mean, it's not even just a human rights issue or a moral issue when you stand up for humanity. It's also actually good policy, because if you think about what got us to this point where you have an Israeli government, the most right-wing ultra-nationalist government in Israel's history, that is incredibly racist and, supports this notion of Jewish supremacy. If you think about how did we get here, it's because we never laid down ground rules, that are based on law and normative behavior. We allowed Israel to think that if you just go through the motions and of this peace process, then we won't be so harsh on your continuing efforts to expand settlements. We won't speak out against you if you participate with Palestinians in negotiations. We'll even provide political cover for you at the UN so that you don't face consequences for your behavior. This was all, basically a kind of contract that the U.S. and the West had with Israel. Just make an effort to participate in these kinds of negotiations, and we'll have your back. And so what it did was it just emboldened a right wing, right? It emboldened a settler movement, and it got us to the point now where we have 25% of the population of the West Bank is Israeli settlers who have no intention of moving, because why should they? They have no intention of considering a two-state solution, because why should they? Who's going to actually force them to make those I want to say concessions, but it's really not concessions when you're talking about giving back something that was taken, which the land that was taken from Palestinians. But I mean, there hasn't been that sort of enforcement of this kind of normative behavior with Israel, and so that's what got us here. And so why I believe
impunity.
It's impunity, and why I support human rights beyond that it's the moral and right thing to do is it is good policy, because you have to change the incentive structure that we've created for Israel, where it's so warped that Israelis think that we will get away with whatever, and we have the U.S. to cover for us, so we'll continue as we have been. You have to change that, and the way to change that is by laying down these rules that we've all accepted to be true as members of the international community, especially after World War II. I mean, we understood the importance of these rules if we want to have the kind of planet that we can live in with some notion of safety and peace. But we've gotten away from that. There was some glimmer of hope in the beginning of the Biden administration that there might be this reprioritization of human rights, of international law. But, that went by the wayside pretty quickly after October 7th.
What do you blame for this impunity? Why is it being granted? Is it linked to the Israeli lobby? Is it part of the funding of elections?
I think,
what's the source of
impunity? I think Israel-Palestine has become a domestic political issue. definitely. It's not just a foreign policy issue. If it was just a foreign policy issue, I think it would be clear what the U.S. national interest is here, what our regional interests are. It's definitely not in seeing perpetual conflict in which the U.S. is bogged down in having to feel the need to respond to every small proxy group in the region, all in defense of an occupation and of a military campaign that's targeting civilians. Obviously, something is wrong here, because it doesn't make any sense if you're just looking at it as a foreign policy question. So yes, it's become a domestic policy issue. Israel-Palestine has entered into the culture wars in the United States, and it's making it a lot harder for us to have a sensible, foreign policy because of that. I think that, we are seeing, though, today, and this is where my optimism you were asking me about comes from, we are starting to see people today really question this. Is this really serving us? Is it serving Americans to be associated with what's going on in Gaza? Is it serving us domestically and what our domestic agenda is? If we're spending money abroad in the billions of dollars to help fund a war on a civilian population, people are asking these questions. It's not just policy wonks like me anymore that are talking about Palestine. I had somebody coming in today who was repairing a microwave, and he was telling me that he's been reading about Palestine and has become interested in what's going on because he doesn't understand, the images he's seeing about what's taking place in Gaza and how the U.S. could be a part of that. So I think, it's my hope is coming from the fact that as devastating as what's happened in Gaza is, it's really it's laid bare sort of the hypocrisy and the contradictions between our stated objectives in our foreign policy and what we're actually being called on to support when it comes to Israel-Palestine.
Zaha, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for putting the human rights and all of the legal issues surrounding that in some perspective for all of us. And thanks for your continued optimism, too.
Thanks for having me, Jim. I really appreciate you talking about this issue and letting others hear about just how devastating and problematic U.S. policy has been for Palestinians, especially in Gaza right now.
And thank you for joining us for Discern This, a podcast that tries to fill in some of the blanks and the gaps in understanding global issues. If you enjoyed this, be sure to follow us here on YouTube or wherever you subscribe. Also, take a look, take a moment to listen to some of the other interviews that we have done and what you can learn there. Thank you all for being with us.